I noticed her hands first, and that is a strange thing for a man like me to admit, because in 30 years of arranging tables and counting bows I have trained myself to notice everything and remark on nothing. But on the second morning of the treaty talks, while the great doors of the conference hall were still being braced open, I saw the young interpreter set her water glass down twice before it stayed, and her hands were shaking so finely that the surface of the water trembled like a struck drum. I am the master of conferences for the house of Kallenor. It is not a grand office. I do not sit at the table. I stand behind the chairs and make the room work, the wine poured to the right depth, no flag higher than another, the men who hate each other not seated where they must pass the same dish. And I make sure the words cross the table cleanly, which is why the interpreter mattered to me, and why her trembling hand stopped me where I stood. Her name was Liesel Varen. She was 23 and the best ear in the realm, which everyone knew and no one said, because she was young and quiet, and the kind of person a room forgets the moment she stops speaking. She spoke 6 tongues without a seam, and she carried the meaning under a man's words and not just the words, the difference between an interpreter and a parrot. The crown had chosen her for these talks over men twice her age. I had signed the order myself. And now she could not hold her water glass. I crossed to her slow, the way you cross to a horse that has been frightened. "Mistress Varen," I said, "the room is warm. Shall I have a window opened?" She looked up at me, and for 1/2 second I saw something behind her eyes that I had seen exactly twice before in my long service, and both times a man had later been found at the bottom of a stairwell. It was fear that had been told to be quiet. It was a person carrying a thing too heavy to set down and too dangerous to name. "Thank you, Master Holt," she said. "I am only tired." She was lying and she was good at it, and that was the worst part. A person who lies that smoothly has been practicing. I want to tell you what these talks were, because the size of the thing matters. The House of Kallenor and the Kingdom of Drevin had spent 11 years in a cold, grinding quarrel over the river border and the high passes, where our shepherds and theirs had killed each other in 2s and 3s for a generation. It was not a great loud war. It was the worst kind, the slow kind, the kind that takes a boy here and a father there and never makes a song, and after 11 years there was hardly a family in the border country that had not buried someone. The treaty was meant to end it. Men who were not at this table would live or die by the words that crossed it. And the words could only cross it through her. That was the thing I should have understood faster. At a table where no man fully trusts the other's tongue, each side's interpreter renders the other side's words, and both sides listen, and if the 2 renderings do not match, the room stops and the difference is hunted down. It is slow. It is meant to be slow. The whole architecture is built on the idea that no single voice can bend the meaning, because 2 voices always check each other. Except that Drevin's senior interpreter had taken ill on the crossing, a fever, they said, sudden, and could not work. And so by the 3rd session, by an arrangement the envoys made over my objections, it had come down to one trusted ear that both delegations would accept, one voice that both kings would believe. Hers. You begin to see it now. I did not see it then, not fully. I saw a frightened girl with shaking hands, and I thought she was overwhelmed by the weight of the room, and I resolved to be kind to her, and I went back to my tables and my flags like a fool. The man who had made her afraid was Garrick Sewell, chief envoy of Drevin, and he was the most dangerous kind of dangerous, which is the patient kind. A big man gone soft in the way powerful men go soft, with a wide pale face, small careful eyes, and a voice like warm oil. He smiled a great deal, laughed at his own small jokes and watched to see who laughed with him, and called everyone my friend in a way that made the word a small leash. In the sessions he was reasonable, almost mournful, full of regret about the dead shepherds, full of warm talk about the children who would grow up never knowing the quarrel. He was very good. I have stood behind 1,000 chairs, and I know a performance when I see one, and Sewell was the best performer I had ever watched work a room. It took me until the fourth morning to see how he looked at her. It was nothing a witness could have sworn to. When Liesel rendered a phrase, Sewell would let his eyes rest on her a beat too long and smile, and the smile did not reach the small, careful eyes, and she would falter only a breath and carry on. It happened 3 times that morning. The third time the phrase she stumbled over was a dull procedural clause about the toll roads, and I watched her stop, start again, and choose her words, and I thought, she is choosing. An interpreter does not choose. An interpreter carries. The moment she chooses, she is no longer carrying our words. She is carrying his. I did not know yet what he had on her. I only knew that something had its hand on the back of her neck, that the something was him, and that the treaty, 11 years and 10,000 graves of it, was passing through a throat he had learned how to close. That night I did not sleep. I walked the empty hall between the cold lamps and tried to think what a man in my office could do. The honest answer was, very little. I could not accuse the chief envoy of Drevin of menacing a girl on the strength of a smile and a falter. I would be laughed out of my own hall, and worse, I would put her in the open, alone, with whatever he held over her. And she would die before she told me, because that is what fear that has been told to be quiet does to a person. So I watched, and while I watched her, I began, without quite meaning to watch the man who watched her. He stood at the western doors on our side, because by the courtesies of a state visit the host provides the standing guard. He was one of ours, a ceremonial guardsman of the Kallenor household, and his name, I learned it later. At the time he was only the western post, was Aldrich Wren. He stood in the gray wool and high black fur and white gloves, hands at rest, eyes level, his whole body so absolutely still that the visiting clerks had taken to setting their cloaks on the rail beside him as though he were a fixture of the architecture and not a man. Everyone forgot he was there. That is the entire point of a man like that. He is furniture until the hour he is not. But it is my work to see the things a room forgets, and over those long days I understood something about the Western Post that no one else had bothered to learn. He saw her too, not the way Sewell saw her, the other way, the way a man watches a thing he is responsible for. When Liesel's hand shook, the guardsman's eyes did not move, but something in the set of his shoulders hardened the way the surface of a pond hardens just before frost. When Sewell let the oily smile rest on her too long, his stillness deepened, became a stillness with weight in it, like a held breath. He never moved. He never spoke. He was not allowed to do either. But he was, I slowly understood, the only other person in that hall who had seen exactly what I had seen. And he had seen it first. I learned what Sewell was holding over her by accident, 3 nights in. The talks had a rhythm, the full sessions by day, the smaller evening meetings where the envoys and their secretaries hammered out the clauses the full table would only ratify. Liesel had to be at those too. There was no one else. And it was after one of these, late, the corridor empty and the sconces burned low, that I came around the turning by the muniment door and heard Sewell's warm voice, low, and I stopped, because a man does not announce himself when a girl's voice answers in that tone. "You worry too much," he was saying, gentle as a nurse. "I am asking very little, a word here and there, a shading. Who is to know a shading? Not your lords, they have no ear. Not mine, I have sent the only ear that could catch you to his bed with a fever." A small laugh. "You see how much I have arranged for you, Liesel. You should be grateful." "It's the toll clause," she said, and her voice was a thread. "If I render it the way you want, my own people will sign away the high passes and not know they have done it. The shepherds, the river country." "The shepherds," he said with great patience, "will die either way, my friend, whether or not you help me. The only question is whether you help me and your brother comes home, or you refuse me, and a letter I have written finds its way to certain men in your father's town, and your brother does not come home, and your father learns what his daughter did in the capital, and his neighbors learn, and that good old man dies of the shame of a thing you did not even do. I have written it very carefully. It would be believed. I have served 3 sovereigns and never wanted to put my hands on a man until that moment, standing in the dark with my own breath loud in my ears. I am not a violent man. I count flags. But I understood the whole shape of it at once, the way you understand a wound the instant before it begins to hurt. He had her brother, a soldier, taken in a border skirmish 2 years gone and held in a drevin hold, a boy whose name no minister would trouble to put on the prisoner lists. And he had a lie, written and waiting, ready to be dropped into a small town where a lie about a girl runs faster than any truth and never stops running. He held her brother's life in one hand and her father's good name in the other, and he asked her to use the rarest gift in the realm, her clean, true ear, to murder a treaty and sell the river country, one shading at a time, in a voice both kings would believe because it was hers. That is how you bend a voice, not with a blade, with everything the voice loves. I went back to my rooms and sat in the dark a long time. I will be honest, because there is no use telling this story if I dress myself up in it. My first thought was not how do I save this girl. My first thought was how do I protect the treaty, and those are not the same thought, and I am not proud of the order they came in. If I pulled her from the table, the talks collapsed. No other ear both sides would accept, Drevin blaming us for the breakdown, the cold, slow war grinding on. If I left her, she would go on bending the words until the thing was signed and the high passes were gone, and the river country was sold into the same quarrel that had buried the last generation. There was no clean move. There is so rarely a clean move. That is the part they never tell you about service. And under both thoughts, quieter, a third I did not want to look at. A girl of 23, alone, doing a brave and terrible thing every single day, choosing her brother's life over her people's, hating herself for it, holding her water glass with both hands so it would not betray her. She had not come to anyone. She had decided she was alone, the way the very young decide with total certainty, and set herself to bear it until it broke her. I thought about the Western Post, the man who had seen it first. I do not know why my mind went to him, a guardsman who had never spoken a word in my hearing and never would, a man whose entire function was to be still. But it did, and in the morning I went to find out who he was. His name was Aldrich Wren, the sergeant of the household section told me, and he had stood the ceremonial line for 9 years, and before that, the sergeant said it flatly, the way these men say the things they are proudest of. Before that he had served 11 years on the border. The river country, the high passes, the exact ground that Sewell was bargaining away one shading at a time. He had carried wounded men down those passes in the snow and buried friends in that ground. And now he stood, by the luck of a duty roster, at the western door of the room where a soft pale man was quietly selling all of it, forbidden by every law of his office to so much as turn his head. I understood his stillness better after that. It was not the stillness of a man who did not care. It was the stillness of a man who cared so much that the only thing holding him together was the discipline of not moving, the way a dam is only a wall until the moment it isn't. I needed proof. That was the whole of my problem the rest of that day. I had heard the corridor, but a master of conferences who says he heard a great envoy threaten a girl in the dark, with no witness and no paper, is a man whose own king will quietly thank him and quietly retire him, because a state visit cannot be allowed to founder on the word of the fellow who arranges the chairs. I needed a thing I could put on a table. And I had only one currency to buy it with, which was her trust, and she did not trust me, rightly, because for the first day after the corridor I had been thinking about the treaty before I thought about her, and the young can smell that on a man. So I changed which thought came first. It is a small thing to write, and it was not a small thing to do. I stopped thinking how do I save the treaty and started thinking how do I save her, and trusted, the way her own guardsman trusted his post, that if I got that part right, the rest might follow, and if it didn't, at least I would not have spent a girl to save a paper. I went to her at the noon recess, when the hall emptied and she stayed behind, as she always did, alone at her small table with her glass of water and her clean fool's cap, too wound up to eat. The Western Post was still at his door. By the courtesy of the recess he could stand at ease, and he did, but he had not gone for his own meal. He stayed. He always stayed when she stayed. I sat down across from her. I did not arrange my face into kindness. I have learned that kindness arranged on a face is the first thing the frightened see through. I just sat, an old man with sore feet, and I said quietly, "I served on the river border once. As a young clerk, I counted the dead for the quartermaster. It is the worst arithmetic there is." She went very still. "Mistress Varen," I said, "I am going to tell you what I think, and you will say nothing, because saying nothing is safest for you, and I would not take that from you. I think a man in this hall holds two things over your head. One wears a uniform in a hold across the river and shares your name. The other is a letter that does not need to be true to ruin a good old man. And I think you have decided to carry both alone, by bending your own voice against your own people because you cannot see another road. Say nothing. Drink your water. I only wanted you to know you are not as alone as he has told you. There is at least one old fool in this hall who knows what is being done to you." And I glanced, only with my eyes, toward the western door, and I do not know to this day what made me say it, and there is at least one other. She did not look at the door. She was too disciplined for that. He had trained her in a way by terrifying her. But I saw her register it. I saw the smallest loosening at the corners of her mouth, the kind of thing that happens to a face that has held one expression for too long and is permitted, for one instant, to hold a different one. "He'll know," she whispered. It was the first true thing she had said to me. "If I tell anyone, if I even look like I might, he watches everything. He has people. The fever that took their senior interpreter wasn't a fever. He arranged the whole table so it would come down to me. He's been arranging it for months." Her hands were pressed flat on the fool's cap to keep them still. "You can't help me. No one can. If I refuse him, my brother dies and my father dies of shame, and the talks fail anyway and they blame us. If I do what he wants, the river country pays for 50 years. There's no version where it comes out right. I've gone through it 100 times. There's no door." "There is always a door," I said, "but it is usually a worse one than the ones you have already tried, which is why you haven't tried it. Tell me one thing only, and then I will leave you in peace. The clause. The toll clause, the one about the high passes. When does it come to the full table?" "Day after tomorrow," she said. "The final session. They want it signed before the moon turns, before either court can find a reason to walk." She looked at me then, and under the fear was a new thing, very small, very fragile. It was hope, and hope is the most dangerous thing you can give a person in a trap, because if you cannot make good on it, you have only made the trap crueler. "Master Holt. If you do anything, anything at all, and it goes wrong, it's my brother who pays. Not you, him. Do you understand what you're holding?" "I understand exactly what I am holding," I said. "It is why my own hands are not steady either. Look." And I held one out, an old man's hand, and let her see it shake so she would know I was not playing at this from some safe height. "We are both afraid. That is all right. Fear is only the body knowing the size of the thing. Now, day after tomorrow, leave me to think." I rose. As I passed the western door, I did a thing that was entirely against the courtesies, a thing a master of conferences should never do, which is that I spoke to the standing guard. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes ahead the way he kept his, and I said very low, as though to myself, as though counting flags, "Day after tomorrow, the toll clause, the high passes." And I walked on, and I did not see him move, because he did not move, because he was the Western Post, and the Western Post does not move. But I felt the stillness change behind me. I felt it the way you feel a man who has just been handed his whole reason for standing there. That night the Western Post found me. He had traded 2 months of holidays to a younger man to be off the roster at that hour, never told me, and I only learned it because the younger man boasted of it. He came to my door out of uniform, in a plain coat, and out of the gray wool and the high black fur he was a different thing entirely. Leaner, older, gray at the temples, a long pale scar along the back of one hand. He stood in my doorway the way he stood at his post, hands at rest, eyes level, and said the first words I ever heard him speak. "I know that clause, Master Holt. I bled for that ground. Tell me what you need me to do, and tell me what I'm not allowed to do, because I will do the first to the letter, and I will not break the second no matter how much I want to." I have thought a great deal in the years since about that sentence. There was the whole man in it. He did not say "I'll handle it" or "let me at him." Any of the things a lesser man would have said with that scar on his hand and that envoy 10 doors down. He said, "Tell me what I may do and what I may not, and I will honor both." He had spent 11 years learning the ground and 9 learning the discipline, and he understood better than I did that the only thing that would beat Sewell was not a stronger arm. It was the one thing Sewell could not imagine, a man who would do exactly the right amount and not 1 ounce more. We talked for 2 hours. The plan grew between us the way a rope is laid, each adding a strand. The trouble was always the same. We could not simply expose Sewell. Even if I stood at the table and named what I had overheard, it was my word against his before both delegations, and the talks would shatter and the blame would be ours, and the girl would be in the open and her brother dead within the month. Sewell had built his whole machine on exactly that. There is no clean move. Every road out led off a cliff, and he had stood at the top of every one, smiling, my friend, and waited. So we stopped looking for the clean move. We looked instead for the things Sewell had not protected, because every man who builds a perfect trap leaves one part unguarded, the part he is sure of. Sewell was sure of her voice. He had spent months and a poisoned interpreter and a held brother, and a written lie making certain the meaning of the treaty could only cross the table through Liesel Varen's throat, and that he owned that throat. His whole scheme rested on one stone, that on the day of the toll clause, hers would be the only ear and the only voice both kings would trust. "Then we take that away from him," the guardsman said slowly, the way a man lays a heavy stone. "Not her, the aloneness. He owns her because she is the only voice. Make her not the only voice and the lie has nothing to stand on. He cannot make her bend the meaning if the meaning is in the room twice." "There is no second ear both sides will accept," I said. He saw to that. "There is one," said Aldrich Wren. "One ear in this hall that has spoken the river tongue since it was a boy, because it grew up on that border carrying messages between the farms and the forts. It is not a trained ear. It would never be allowed at a treaty table in 1,000 years." He looked at me level. "But it is honest. And on the day that clause is read, it will be standing at the western door, where no one ever looks, hearing every word." I sat back. I understood, and the understanding was cold and bright. He was not proposing to break his post. He was proposing to use it. The very thing that made the guardsmen invisible, that he was furniture, that the delegations hung their cloaks on his rail, and discussed their secrets a yard from his face, because he was a fixture and not a man, had let Sewell conduct his entire scheme within arm's reach of the one witness who could understand both sides of it and would never be suspected of understanding anything at all. "You've understood it," I said softly. "All of it, the corridor, the clauses, every shading she's been forced to put in. You've stood there hearing every word and not been able to move." "For 4 days," he said, and for the first time something moved in the level voice and was put away again. "It is the hardest post I have stood, harder than the passes. On the passes you are allowed to act. Here I have had to stand and hear it and trust that a man would come who could do what I cannot. You came." He paused. "Now let me do the small part I can, and tell her, because if she does not know, she will go on bending the words to protect her brother, and all of it is for nothing." That was the hinge of the whole thing. The plan was nothing if Liesel did not know she had a second voice in the room. She had to render the clause straight, risk everything. Her brother, her father, all of it, on one true rendering, and she would only do that if she knew an honest ear stood at the western door to catch her if Sewell's people swore she had lied. She had to be brave at the exact moment she had been most thoroughly taught to be afraid. We were not asking her to be saved. We were asking her to save herself with us behind her. It is a harder thing to ask of a frightened person, and a better one. "I'll tell her," I said, "in the morning, quietly, and Wren," he had turned to go, "what you may not do, say it back to me, so I know we are agreed." He stopped in the doorway, the plain coat hanging off the soldier's frame, and said it like a man reciting a vow, which I suppose he was. "I may not lay a hand on a guest of the crown except to stop a present harm. I may not speak at the table. I may not draw. The worst thing I could do to her tomorrow is give that soft man the one thing he has been trying to manufacture for 4 days, a host guardsman who lost his discipline and assaulted a foreign envoy. That breaks the talks, hangs the blame on us, and ends her brother. So I will give him a stillness he cannot use. I will be furniture until the exact half-second I am not, and then I will be exactly enough, and not 1 ounce more." "Not 1 ounce more," I said. "Not 1 ounce more," said Aldrich Wren, and he went out into the dark to trade another favor I never learned about, so that he would be standing the western post when the toll clause came to the table. I told her in the gray of the next morning, in the small antechamber where the interpreters drew their water, the door propped so it would not look like a meeting. I told her quickly. There was a second ear in the room whose it was, where he stood, what ground he had bled for. On the toll clause she would render it true, exactly true, not one shading, the high passes spoken plainly the way our side had written them. And if Sewell's delegation cried that she had mistranslated, there would be a man at the western door who had understood every word in both tongues and would, at my single signal, put the truth on the table where no one could take it back. She listened with her hands flat on the basin's edge, and when I finished she did not look relieved. She looked more afraid, and I respected her for it. "If it fails," she said, "my brother. If it fails, I will have failed, and I will spend whatever is left of my office getting your brother off that prisoner list. He goes on the exchange list today, under my own hand, as a man the House of Kallenor wants home. Sewell's letter to your father, a household courier, is already riding ahead of it. Your father will have the truth before the lie reaches his town, and a household courier's word in the river country, where they remember which uniform carried their wounded, outweighs any anonymous letter. We cannot make tomorrow safe. We can only make it so you are not the one standing alone in front of it. Will you render it true?" She was quiet, and the water dripped, and somewhere down the corridor the great doors were being braced open for the final session. And then she said a thing I have never forgotten, in the flat, steady voice she used at the table, the one that did not shake. "4 days I've been the only voice in that room," she said. "To be the only one who can carry the truth, and to be the one bending it, it's the loneliest thing in the world. I'd have given anything for a second ear." She dried her hands. "Yes, I'll render it true, and tell your guardsman I knew he was there, from the first day. A man stands that still, you feel him watching the way you feel the sun through a window. I thought he was Sewell's. I'm glad I was wrong." The final session began at the 3rd hour, and the hall was as full as I had ever seen it. Both kings sat that day. That was the gravity of the toll clause, the sovereign of Kallenor at the head of our side, the king of Drevin facing him, the lords and secretaries and clerks ranked behind them, and at her small table set forward where both thrones could see her, Liesel Varen, her hands held perfectly, perfectly still. And at the western door, the one no eye in that room had rested on in 9 years, the furniture, the man who had bled for the ground about to be spoken aloud. Garrick Sewell was magnificent that morning. I will give the devil that. Warm and mournful and reasonable, full of the children who would grow up never knowing the quarrel, and when the toll clause was brought forward, he folded his soft hands and bowed his head as though to a hard but necessary thing. He glanced at Liesel once, the small careful eyes, the smile that did not reach them, and my heart climbed into my throat because I saw her not falter. She had decided. A person who has decided looks different from one still afraid, and she had crossed over in the night. And Sewell, watching for the falter, did not see the crossing because the crossing was invisible, the way the best things are. The clause was read out in our tongue by our chief secretary, plain and full. The high passes and the river border held in joint stewardship, neither court to set a toll upon them, the shepherds of both lands to graze and pass as they had before the quarreling began. It was the clause that ended the war. And then it came to her to render it into the tongue of Drevin, for that king and his lords to hear and weigh. And the whole 11 years and 10,000 graves came down, as Sewell had built it to the throat of one young woman he believed he owned. She rendered it true. I heard it. I do not have the river tongue well, but I have enough, and I heard her speak the high passes plainly, joint stewardship, no toll, the shepherds to pass as before, the clause whole. The clause our side had written, not one shading, not one soft place where the meaning could leak out. She gave Garrick Sewell's king the truth in Garrick Sewell's own tongue, and she did it in the flat, steady, professional voice, and she did not look at Sewell, and her hands did not shake. For one heartbeat the hall simply received it, and the king of Drevin nodded slowly, gravely, a man hearing a fair thing. And I thought, I will confess it, for one heartbeat I thought we had won so easily that I had imagined the whole danger. Then Garrick Sewell rose to his feet. "Your Majesties," he said, warm, sorrowful, spreading his soft hands, "I am grieved to do this. I am grieved beyond words, but I cannot let it stand. The interpreter has erred." He turned the small, careful eyes on Liesel, and the smile this time was sad, a man forced to a painful duty. "She is young. She is tired, we have all seen how tired. But what she has just rendered to my king is not the clause that was read. She has shaded it, Majesties. Where your clause grants joint stewardship, she has rendered it as Calinor's sole stewardship. Where it says no toll, she has rendered a toll to be set by your court alone. I do not say it was malice." He let that hang, having said exactly that it was malice. "I say only that the meaning that has reached my king through her voice is not the meaning your court intends, and a treaty signed on a corrupted rendering is no treaty at all. We must adjourn. We must, regretfully, bring in another ear." Of which, of course, there was none. Or take the word Majesties of the only senior interpreter present who has the river tongue, mine. It was beautifully done, the whole trap sprung at last in front of two kings. He had let her render it true, and then declared the true rendering false, and now it was her unsupported word against his, a tired young woman against a great envoy, and the obvious resolution, another trusted ear led nowhere, because he had poisoned the only other ear weeks ago, leaving Sewell himself the only remaining authority on what had been said in the river tongue. He had not needed her to bend the words after all. He had only needed everyone to believe she might have. 4 days terrifying her so she would either bend the clause and he won, or render it true and crack under his accusation, which would prove him right, and he won anyway, his own false meaning in its place. There was no door. He had built it so there was no door. I saw Liesel's face go white. I saw her open her mouth to defend herself and find nothing to defend with, his word against hers, his the word of a kingdom's chief envoy, hers a girl's, and the old aloneness came down over her like a falling shutter. And across the hall the king of Drevin began to frown, troubled, half persuaded, a careful man who could not simply ignore his own chief envoy's grave and sorrowful accusation, and I felt the whole thing tilting toward adjournment and ruin, the treaty sliding off the table into the 11-year dark. And I raised my hand, one finger the signal, the smallest motion a man can make. I did not look at the western door. I looked at Liesel, so she would have one steady face to hold to. But I heard it, the thing the whole hall heard and did not, for one confused instant, understand. A single set of measured footsteps on the stone, unhurried, even, the pace of a man who has all the time in the world because he has waited 9 years for these particular 40 feet. The furniture had moved. The western post had left his door. A gasp went up, a host guardsman leaving his post, walking onto the open floor of a treaty session between two kings, was a thing without precedent, close to scandal. And I saw Sewell's small eyes widen and then narrow, the first flicker of his certainty failing, because a soldier did not belong in his careful geometry of voices and lies, and a soft, clever man's first instinct when a soldier appears is fear, and the second is to reach for the very thing the soldier must not be given. Aldrich Wren stopped in the center of the floor between the two thrones, the gray wool, the high black fur, the white gloves, the level eyes. He did not look at Sewell. He did not draw. He wore the ceremonial rifle and did not so much as touch it. He turned to the sovereign of Calenor, then with perfect courtesy to the king of Drevin, and bowed to each exactly the same depth, neither higher than the other. And I, the man who measures bows for a living, marked that he had measured it perfectly, and I could have wept. And then Aldrich Wren spoke, in the tongue of Drevin. It was not elegant. He had warned me it would not be. It was the rough river dialect of a man who had learned it carrying messages as a boy, blunt and plain and unmistakable, and that very plainness was the most credible thing the hall had heard all day, because no one performs in a dialect they learned barefoot. He repeated, word for word, in the king of Drevin's own tongue, exactly what Liesel had rendered. Joint stewardship. No toll. The shepherds of both lands to pass as before. The clause whole. And then he said, in that same plain, rough speech, looking at neither envoy nor king but at the air between them, the way a guard looks at nothing. That is what she said, Majesty. I heard it. I have the river tongue. I have had it since I was a boy on that border, carrying water to men who spoke it. She rendered the clause true, every word. There was no shading. I would stake my post on it. I am staking my post on it now. The hall was utterly silent. And into that silence the king of Drevin, half persuaded a moment before, turned his slow, grave eyes not to Liesel and not to the guardsman but to his own chief envoy, and asked him one quiet question in the river tongue, and I did not need the words to read the answer in Sewell's soft, pale face, because Sewell, for the first time in 4 days, did not have one. He had built his trap on the certainty that no honest ear in that hall could check him. He had never once, in all his careful months, looked at the furniture by the western door. And now the furniture stood on the floor speaking his own king's tongue, and there was nothing for Sewell to say, for to call the guardsman a liar was to call him a liar in a language the whole Drevin delegation could hear and judge for themselves, and they knew their own dialect when it was spoken to them straight. Sewell tried, of course. A man like that always tries. He laughed the warm, oily laugh and said something about a common soldier's crude grasp of a subtle tongue, and the king of Drevin held up one hand and stopped him. I have served a long time, and I know the gesture a king makes when he has just understood that his most trusted man has been lying to him. It is a small gesture. It is the end of a career inside a single motion of a hand. What followed took weeks to unwind, and I will not weary you with the diplomacy of it. The bones are these. The toll clause was entered as Liesel had rendered it, true and whole. The treaty was signed before the moon turned. The 11-year quarrel ended, and the shepherds of the river country graze the high passes to this day without paying a coin to any king. Sewell was recalled to Drevin in disgrace. The poisoned interpreter recovered, which told its own story to the men who needed to read it. And Liesel's brother came home that autumn on the exchange, under my own hand and the king of Drevin seal both. For that king, once he understood what had been done in his name, was decent enough to want it set right himself. The letter to her father never had its chance. The household courier was faster, as Wren had said. Her father held the truth a full day before the lie reached his town, and in the river country, where they remember which uniform carried their wounded down the passes, that was worth more than all the anonymous letters ever written. Liesel works at the table still. She is the senior ear of the realm now, and when a delegation arranges to bring its own interpreter she insists, every time, with a quiet iron that startles the great men who try to talk her out of it, that there be a second honest ear in the room, always, even an unofficial one, even furniture, because she learned in 4 lonely days exactly what is done to a voice that is allowed to stand alone. And Aldrich Wren stood his post. They wanted to make a thing of him, a commendation, an honor, a place at the table itself, the man who saved the treaty, and he declined all of it flatly, the way these men decline things as though it were nothing. He had left his post for 40 feet and the length of one true sentence, then walked back to the western door and stood it for 3 more years until his knees gave out, and in all that time I never once heard him speak of what he had done. The chronicles of the treaty do not mention him. They say the interpreter rendered the clause true and the accusation collapsed of its own falseness, and they leave it there. And Wren, when I told him so, said only that it was the right way to write it, because the marvel was never the soldier. But I am an old man now, and I have arranged my last table, and I will tell you what I learned standing behind those chairs. They thought her voice was the weak place. Sewell spent months learning to bend it, and he was right that a voice can be bent. Almost any voice, given the right weight on it, will bend. What he never understood, because it was the one thing his soft, clever kind cannot imagine, is that a bent voice can still be straightened if there is one steady thing in the room for it to lean against. He built a trap with no door in it, and forgot that a door is not the only way out of a room. Sometimes the way out is a man standing so still, for so long, in a corner everyone has stopped seeing, that when the hour finally comes, he can carry the whole weight of the truth across the floor in his own rough voice and set it down gently, where 2 kings can see it, and then walk back to his door and stand there and never tell a soul. That is the voice they tried to bend. They bent her for 4 days, but they never once looked at the one beside her that would not.